closure experiences. It seems weird, doesn't it? Suddenly the design, the ending of stuff. But we often design the beginning of things and overlook the ending of things. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about there. If you want to go to the website or tweet. Right, what I want to talk to you about is defining what a closure experience is, because at the moment it sounds very abstract to you and a bit weird. Why it's important to consider it in the customer life cycle, and why our particular life cycle is very biased towards starting experiences. What created this situation? So we look at the past, and we'll look at some examples from different industries as well and how they've changed over time. Also, examples of closure experiences which are doing well and badly in our current sort of society, and some techniques and models you can use to think about them as well. So I define closure in this context as the satisfactory conclusion to a product or service relationship. Each party feeling satisfied with a completed transaction, it being a fair and just conclusion without consequence. Now, without consequence echoes something that we've done in the past to our product ecosystem, which is literate, and without consequence in our sort of chemical ecosystem and things with like formaldehyde, we've had a consequence thereafter. After that experience has gone, there's been an echo, some sort of awful shadow. And this is what we want to start thinking about designing out of that sort of experience life cycle. Now we can break any customer experience or consumer experience down into three basic stages. The onboarding phase, which is sort of the starting experience, the usage, and then the offboarding phase. And if you think about that as an arc, as the consumer starts to go from here, as engagement goes upwards, as over time they go along this axis. I'm just going to move this hand out of the way. Don't really want that there. Anyway, and then the sort of things you have in starting experiences are when you get into things like advertising. It attracts you to something. You get into marketing. It like maybe helps you formulate your ideas around something and getting into it. And then you have that packaging experience, unwrapping that, and then your T's and C's or something like that. All of these are sort of touch points on the journey into being fully engaged at the top of the life cycle. Then we have this thing in the middle, which is usage. And you start using it as you imagine, or as that service is, or as that app is. But then we have a bit of a gap between that and our interest. We start to have a different language. There's a different discussion going on. That language is the closure experience. Language is very much fueled by society and our responsibilities around that. And that language is also about safety and security. It's about sort of quite traditional things like guilt and stuff, which isn't very complicated. It's not very sophisticated. Very different to what we have in advertising, which is a lot more about like how wonderful you feel, that sort of self-actualization, that sort of Coca-Cola moment. And we have an interest gap between the two, which is what's killing a lot of the discussion off, and the things that we can't resolve in our current society is partly the problem around the starting experience and the closure experience being broken. So we have this interest gap. And before we know it, as consumers and providers and producers, we're straight back to creating a new starting experience. And everyone wants to get back into a new thing instead of responsibly end things boringly, because we're not interested in it and we don't design for it often. So what we can assume for that is the customer life cycle is very biased. There's a gap of interest, not only for consumers, but also producers, the consequences of which are all around us. We can argue that the way we've dealt with the physical landscape is a consequence of this lack of interest between the two and the lack of joining those two together. And the consumers and industry are in this sort of codependent denial of it. But I'm not going to say like that I've come up with this, because this has been evolving for hundreds of years. We've had a long, emotional and big changes in the last few hundred years in our society, which have fueled this type of change. So, when you think back a few hundred years, we were all wallowing around in the mud, thinking how tough life was. You'd be in total poverty. You'd probably be starving. You'd have horrible, long-winded days. And it was very, very tough. Death was a very familiar figure in this part of life. So, enormous infant mortality. Often people would die from diseases. And when you have that sort of horrible life, you really want an alternative to life, which was heaven. So hundreds of years ago, heaven was a really big deal in our society, and we all wanted to get through life, to get to heaven. And the access to heaven, though, was really controlled by religion. They had a rule book how to get into heaven, and if we didn't abide by that rule book, we wouldn't be getting in. And then what happened is the Industrial Revolution started to happen, and we started to produce products at scale, mass production. We all started to benefit from that, and we all started to have a little bit of an easier life, and we all started to have a little bit of comfort on earth, and we started to have a little bit of heaven on earth. That heaven emerged in this sort of abundance where we started to produce more comfortable things and have a sort of a comfortable life in a lot of senses. And at the same time, medicine started to push back on death. Medicine started to enable us to have longer lives. It used to save people from dying. And equally, it sort of turned it into a service to look after people's life and look after people's death. And we could hide death away in hospitals, behind the curtain of service personnel and these places. We could hide death away. And that would free us to sort of indulge in that heaven on earth and do that without end, because we deserved to consume without end. And what's happened is that consumer experiences have mimicked this. We've had closure hundreds of years ago was respected as a metaphor of death. It was respected. You were familiar with it. You had responsibility around things. And as we've become closer to the modern times, closure's become distant. We're not that interested in it. It's alien, and we dodge it. And that's what's happened in our consumer experiences. So if we look at that from an industry point of view, we can see how industry has done similar things. So if you think about products, hundreds of years ago, you would have quite a close relationship with people who produced a product, maybe a belt buckle or a cabinet or something like that. And then you'd take that home with you, you'd look after it, you might mend it, you might take it back to that person to mend it as well. But now we have such a wealth of products, there's none of that real cycle going on. We actually just like having those starting experiences. 650 products, new products are created every day around the world. That's an incredible amount, isn't it? And you think how many of those have got marketing campaigns, have terrible meetings about what strategy they're going to do for their marketing campaign, or how, is the packaging looking the right colour? Lots of products. But we see it also in the service sector. You see similar experiences in services. Hundreds of years ago, again, you would have a relationship with your employer, which would mean that you have one pension. You'd work for them for all your life. When you get into your sort of 65, 70s, you'd end up getting that pension, leaving and drifting off into life after work and death, eventually. The problem is now we have separate pension pots. And those separate pension pots, hardly any of you are employed here, but I guess hardly any of you have also got pension pots. You get a separate pension pot for each person who employs you. I know I've lost one in my life, a pension pot. That's got a few £1,000s in it. I've been employed for 20 years. The FD of us two, he'd lost 2 pension pots. This is a guy who's the financial director of a company. And Age Concern think one in 4 of these pension pots has gone missing, just through lack of us being able to close that loop. Now, there have been stuff that's been introduced to try and do that, which is the automatic transfer mechanism, but let's wait to see how that works. Similar with banking, previously to the crash, people would change their bank account every 26 years. If you think how long, 26 years, that's on average. People were probably having the same bank account all their life. The UK government then asked, and a lot of that was because people couldn't move their bank account very quickly. It would take you months maybe, because you'd have loads of direct debits set up, and banks weren't interested in allowing people to move because they weren't interested in doing closure experiences. Now the UK government requires everyone to do it in 7 days, which has changed the dynamic of it. And we've done it with technology. Every time, when I first signed up for an internet type service, it was probably in the mid-90s, I'd done it by a fax machine, which gives you an idea of how robust that whole model was. And I've been signing up to stuff ever since, and I guess you guys have all been doing the same. You've been signing up for things, but I can count on my hand how many times I've broken those sign-up agreements or ended some of those accounts. I've just let them linger. I've just let them drift. And I have no idea where a load of those relationships have gone, and I have no idea where a load of those accounts, passwords, usernames, they've been merged with databases as companies get merged. That's a lot of unclosed relationships out there. And if this is the equivalent of a physical landscape we've been littering for hundreds of years, we're now littering a digital landscape. You can see it in social as well, the way we flippantly chuck photographs around. This is a beautiful example of that. Where you think that the consequences of taking a photograph and putting it online, in this context, could potentially lead to a rhino being killed by some poachers. It's incredible. But this is, it's not just about the companies and some sort of marketing stuff. This is actually in our psyche as well. Little do many of us know, we're all suffering from a thing called terror management theory. Ernest Becker wrote a book called Denial of Death in the mid-70s. It won the Pulitzer Prize. He suggested that so much of our society is based around us avoiding death through different actions that we do. We do that through the things that we create. We're hoping to create things that last longer than our lifespan. And you can see that in cultures where they create society rules and laws, and also sort of the statues or the representations that we do in society through architecture. But even as individuals, you might want to create things, especially as creative people. You want to create things that will outlive you. So we're all suffering from a denial that things end. It's built in our psyche. Another component to that psychology in all of us is the need to have closure, and we're all a bit more tolerant of it in different levels. So some of us, and probably in this room, we're a lot more happy to have a little bit more chaos at this end of that spectrum, a little bit more disorder and possibility in our life. But there'll be aspects of our life that we want to have a bit more closure and a bit more coherence and a bit more ending to things, something which we can pin down. And that's important that we do that, but we're not doing it in the right places. We might do it emotionally ourselves, but we need to start doing it in the things that we create. So we all have varying degrees of comfort with closure. I don't know does anyone know what this is? Can you imagine where that goes? This is a colonoscope, and it goes up the rectum. And from this, Daniel Kahneman done some research about how uncomfortable this was. It's quite a normal procedure, and it has a similar longevity. It can go on for like about 20 minutes, or it can be over in about 4 minutes. But it's quite uncomfortable, as you can imagine, being put up your bottom. And it allowed him to start understanding what our tolerance is of pain and experience, and how things end. He done some research and understood how much pain people were experiencing at the time of going through this procedure. So they would click something which would say, how much pain are you experiencing now? How much pain are you experiencing now? And how much are you experiencing at the end? And from that bit of research, he could define that people experience things in peaks and troughs and at the moment of the ending. So what happens is, over periods of time, people are feeling agony. That's a low peak, so painful peak. But in all experiences, we experience a high peak. So on holiday, you often only experience, you might remember particularly a point of that holiday. But the other thing that he found out was that everyone experiences the end in a particularly different way. So you experience peaks and endings. You don't necessarily experience an average across all of this and then say it's this, which is an important aspect to how we experience things. So we can say closure is an important way of how we remember things. Another component of this that came out of that research that Daniel Cohen done was that you have two modes when you're remembering things. That you remember as an experiencing person and you remembering as a remembering person. So he believed that the experiencing self is the one that answers the question, does it hurt now? The remembering self is the one that answers the question, how was it on the whole? And from that aspect, we can think about how we design all sorts of things between what you're experiencing at the time and what you're experiencing at the end. But we often don't design endings. No one's interested in endings because we've got a society that's fueled by commerce and more sales and not more conclusion. So with that, you can remember the experiences are in two modes, the way we remember. And lastly, on this component of the presentation, I'm going to talk about first stage of role exit. Now, this woman, Helen Rose Brooks, I don't know how you can have a four-barrel name, but that's quite a lot to take in. She used to be a nun, and then she left the order of being nuns, and she went into psychology, and she started working on how people leave things, people being exes, whether you're an ex-policeman, fireman, teacher, whether you change genders, so you're an ex-male or ex-female, or whether you were in the nuns and you're an ex-nun, etc. This also is quite relevant for how we design things. So how you experience, and when you're designing services, it means that you have a moment of this which is set off with a sort of initial doubt. Whenever you start to change things and think, I don't think this role is right for me, whether that be in a job or in some sort of aspect of your life, it always starts with this first nagging doubt. You then inquire to your friends through cueing behaviour. You say, hey, I think that didn't work out for me. What do you think? Well, I'm thinking of doing this. You start to chat to your friends about it, and what you're doing is looking for sort of cueing behaviour. And if that cueing behaviour is they say yes, or yeah, I think that didn't work out for you, you start to get reinforcement of doubts, and then you start to look for other evidence of that. You end up seeking alternatives. Now, what happens is that when you design something, a lot of companies aren't interested in looking for how people leave companies. They're interested in acquiring more growth. But companies like USwitch and a lot of price comparison sites, all they're doing is introducing a tiny component of doubt into people's mind. And then they've got you hooked. And it's a really interesting way of starting to design for change. So closure is about starting with a little bit of doubt. And so let's go into some of the examples. Has anyone ever heard of this website, Our Incredible Journey? No? So, Our Incredible Journey documents the leaving letters from founders of startups. There's stacks of companies which do startups, and loads of them are really hit, and they last for about 8 months, and then they all die off because they didn't get second round funding. However, they all often leave an ending letter to the people who are the users of that service. And they have a similar, almost a template for that thing. What they end up saying is like a goodbye. Hey, we're happy to announce that we've made loads of money and we're selling out to Yahoo. That's not actually saying that, but that's what they're doing. They're saying, yeah, we sold out to Yahoo. This is our goodbye to all the customers. And the trouble is that that's not the end of it for the customers. Is they haven't. All of the people who are really experiencing the service, the closure experience, they have horrible times from a lot of the startups. So you've got Blink here, which is asking for, like, what does it mean to a Blink user? In the next few weeks, we'll be shutting down a Blink service for many of you, and you can email us on this. It's not a great closure experience, is it, for a lot of the people who've put a lot of effort and time into that service, a lot of their personal photos or whatever that is into that service, and then they've left. You can see it also in the sort of comments on the App Store, where a company like Readmill, once they left or they sold out, loads of people started complaining in the App Store about once the money comes in, then everyone doesn't care and they shut down the service. And where are they going to go now? There's all of these anxieties for these people who haven't really had a completed experience for that. And it's not only the small companies like startups, some of the big companies do it as well. When you have a merger like Microsoft and Nokia sent this letter to my wife, and this is the language they use. They're so wrapped up in legalities that they haven't talked to the user at all. So my wife's data is now... So with the completion of this transaction, a Microsoft Finnish affiliate, what the fuck is that? Assumes responsibility for your personal data and the contractual relationships, the products and services related to this business. I have no idea what they're talking about. They're not really talking to me. They're talking law to us, and then we'll overlook that and move on. I just don't understand. And then there's another paragraph says this, which is almost totally conflicting. It says, please note that Nokia will continue to run its business and responsibility of your personal data and your contractual relationship relating to these Nokia products and services remain with Nokia. So who owns me? Who owns my data? It's like mum and dad have split up and we're still in discussions. Who am I going to live with? This is a funny one. There's a company called Long Access, which is, they're trying to do the equivalent of like safety deposit box online. When you think about how important a safety deposit box is and how much that should emulate real security and satisfaction of it, you start to think like, well, when you use language like this, so this is the sort of National Archives. The accessibility of information is therefore highly vulnerable in today's rapidly evolving technical environment. They know what they're up to with archiving things. This company, however, though, the flippant sort of language, how do I know Long Access will be around in 30 years from now? Soon enough, we will be announcing a structure that will address these kind of concerns even better. What a terrible sentence, for starters. And stay tuned for more details. If you want reassurance over a really long period of time, and think of that satisfaction and conclusion, and closure experience, then you've really got to know what you're talking about on every level, haven't you? That hasn't been designed well. Kickstarter, I think, is a really wonderful service, but I'm often really interested in the stories of how it's ended. They always sound like amazing stories at the start, where, yeah, we're going to start this thing up, and this theatre thing, or this film thing, and these really exciting stories. And the arc of experience for everyone who's invested in it. And I've got a friend who invested in Pebble watches when they first came out, and it looked beautiful in all the pictures. And when it came out, it looked really cheap. And I think a lot of people experience that with Kickstarter. It's often very much about the starting experience and the funding. And I know it's meant to be very much a charitable thing, but their closure experiences are often almost as bad as my high contrast pictures I was doing there. Look at that terrible type of blue on orange. Well done, Joe. There's also aspects of closure experiences in the jobs we have. When you go into a restaurant or you get your hair cut or you have a taxi journey, there's a component of that where you have a say which is very different to other jobs. When you're paying for the service that is delivered before you pay for it, you've got a lot more say as a customer. And that actually helps a lot of people in those things to understand how to get good feedback. Feedback's really valuable for where you're trying to improve in your job. And some people do it much better than others. And that's also a really important aspect of that conclusion to any service. You get a lot of feedback at the end. Has anyone heard of Abimo? Sony developed a robot dog. Now, this was about 15 years ago. A lot of the dogs now are starting to wear out, and Sony's just stopped mending them. So now you've got this situation where a lot of people are quite passionate about these robot dogs they had. They've done all sorts of quirky things. And they had some really interesting variables that gave them almost individual type personalities. Once Sony stopped mending them, there start to be these little services which would hack these old Sony dogs And you'd see images of like all of these dogs with legs missing, etc. And some guy in Japan sort of mending them and hacking these things together as some sort of apocalyptic landscape. The irony is, though, that these dogs lasted almost the same amount of time that a real dog lasted, where they missed a trick, really, because they didn't really think of the ending, that now it's such an emotional ending that people are having almost like funerals for these robot dogs, and really makes you think there's a wonderful closure experience into this, which we should be thinking of a lot more. Liverpool Care Pathway was a part of the hospice movement, and it's about taking the drugs away and having a more responsible end-of-life experience, instead of the sort of rather interventory thing you might get at hospital when you're dying or a loved one's dying. You want to experience them in their last moments in a far more cerebral way, and they might have a more meaningful conversation with you. And that was a really important aspect of the Liverpool Care Pathway. This has come under some discussion more recently with different other modes of hospice care in hospitals, but I think it's an important aspect of end of life. Kai introduced a 7-year warranty, which was totally different to the rest of the market at that time. Mercedes and BMW, etc., used to talk about longevity of products, quality of products, which they'd give a 2-year warranty on or something like that. The difference, Kai came into the market and said, we're going to put 7-year warranty on this. That takes it out into a totally different emotional discussion. You're talking about lifespans with 7 years. You're not talking about quality of products. And they disrupted that whole market. And it's a fascinating approach to how we should be thinking about longevity, not about starting experiences. And the collapsible water bottle, this, I think, has a lot more to say with an experience where you push it over the hill into the sort of landfill, and you start to think of it in the landfill. A lot of our recycled discussions are around chemicals and material breakdown, and you separating your different things when you start to put things out for rubbish. But the important thing with a collapsible water bottle is you're experiencing what might happen, and you're starting to experience that volume in the landfill. And that's really important to how we start thinking about endings. U-switch we talked about earlier. It's about bringing that sort of little bit of doubt into the beginning of that process. iTunes T's and C's, I guess almost everyone here is signed up for that, or I guess 80% of you. How many of you are on Android? Anyone on Android? Yay, 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 yay. So iTunes T's and C's, there's 20-odd thousand words in the T's and C's for iTunes. You sign up for it, you pretty much only have an option of signing up for that. There's an agree or not agree. If you don't agree, you're not going to be using your phone. If you agree, you then are passed over into experiencing the product. But at the end of that life cycle, there's hundreds of ways you can break that terms and conditions as a user, and every one of those possibilities is listed in the terms and conditions. And that's Apple's way of you ending this relationship. There's none in terms of you ending this relationship amicably. What you have to do is turn your phone off, but that's not explicit in the T's and C's. It's interesting to look through the T's and C's and say, how can I end this relationship amicably without breaking the contract? And not many companies do it. Facebook actually acknowledges that you might want to end this relationship now, which has been after a lot of lobbying from many people. But it's interesting to look at T's and C's on that level. The right to be forgotten is an issue that's come up in the European Union over the last few years. There's a lot of history around this as well, because there's situations which has been similar to when you've been to prison and you come out and you want to try and change your life for the better, etc. And there's a bit of history around that, which is, I think, important to have context for. But now, with digital, we have so much stuff that we've done online, and sometimes not all of it is something we want online. Sometimes we want to maybe not have that online or remove it, and some aspects of that are well warranted. The trouble is that there's very few ways to do it. Now, Google and Yahoo and Bing and all of the other search engines are in discussion with the European Union. It's actually now law, so they have to take certain things off. It's called delinking. Delinking isn't taking things off the internet. Delinking is just removing it from the search engine query. So you can't find it from Google, but it's still out there. So every time you put an image out there, that's there forever. You ain't getting that back. So every aspect of things that you've got online, you're never going to get rid of, even if you get it delinked from Google or Bing or Yahoo or whoever. It's a worrying component to our life, and this is the sort of pollution that is going to come back to us in a sort of psychological level in the next few decades. Snapchat, on the other side, deleting a video which you didn't want out there is a perfect example of it. Snapchat, I think, is a really healthy app. You take a video, you send it to someone, you can delete it, or imagery. And that's a healthy way to deal with these things. Rando, has anyone heard of Rando? Yay! So Rando is something we made at Us Too. The idea of a message in a bottle and how beautiful somebody picking up a bottle and taking a message out of it on a beach or somewhere and thinking, where did that come from? Isn't that wonderful? And you imagine that other world, or that other part of the world. And so we've created an app like that. It was an anonymous photo sharing app. So you would take photographs, you'd share them, and you'd put them up into the cloud, and then you would get one back. And it was wonderful. You'd sort of like get these ones back from all over the world. We had stuff from, it started to kick off in Russia, so we got a lot of Russian stuff for a bit, and then China, and then South Korea, and this pop star started, he started getting really into Rando, and he had millions of followers in Korea. I don't suppose any of you have heard of him, but he had millions of followers, and then we just had loads and loads of imagery from Korea, and it was wonderful. It was a free app, and we'd done it out of just an interest in doing it. Sadly, well, actually, it wasn't that sad. It had come to an end of its life and an end of interest for us. But some Russian hackers hit it with like 50,000 photos over a few seconds, and they kept doing that. And that knocks our servers over because our servers can't handle that amount of batch coming in. So we decided to end Rando. What was really good about that is that when you end something and you only got anonymous people on it, is no problem. All of the photos, there was no names and faces against any of them. So there was no problem just killing it off. And that's a healthy way to start to create this sort of ecosystem of digital products. We're fascinated with ourselves, but we can also think around this issue. So these are some techniques that you might think about when you're designing services or products or digital products. But there's a whole customer life cycle going on, through awareness, considerations, selection, sign up, first use, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, closure. Now, an important part of how closure experiences happen actually happens in the transaction model. You set up a transaction model, and that immediately sets up a bias relationship between the customer and the provider. Now, there's 5 different models for transactions. That first, payment after delivery. That's things like restaurants and plumbers and hairdressers. And you have a discussion. As a consumer, you have a discussion at the end of that and said, like, oh, I don't think that went well. I'm not going to tip you. Or, like, that was a wonderful meal. That service was great. Let's tip them. You've got a say in a bit of a feedback loop there. Payment before delivery, though, things that you have on trains and planes, as soon as that starts messing up, you've got no say. You've already paid for it. You end up having to fill in a form or something. Recently, Virgin, and this is, I think, a very sensible thing to do, Virgin introduced an automatic pay-back system whenever any of their trains were late. And that's how these models should be starting to work. We should be paying the customer back immediately instead of filling in forms that from the 18th century as a model. Scheduled payment, things like gym membership, insurance and utility payments, whenever you get into that sort of stuff, because they're scheduled and they go out of your bank account regularly, they're in the background. No one cares about them. The customer doesn't care about them, the utility company doesn't. And that's why you end up with really boring relationships in this. And what happens is that company doesn't care about it, and they often have bad customer relationships, stuff. And gym memberships are classic as well. You care for it like 2 months, and then so January, gyms are full up with people who are really passionate about getting fit. Come April, they're back down to their normal level, and everyone's paying a regular payment throughout that year, and gyms make loads of money. A synchronous payment, obviously that's come from a product industry, where you go to a shop and you get a product and you'll pay them, synchronous. But with digital, you've had that sort of on steroids now, and where we can have instant satisfaction of downloading a new app or buying some sort of digital product, it instantly transfers. That's a really healthy way to do it. A more concerning thing, and that's happening now, is the currency change. Every one of us is now under some sort of continuous observation. You're worth hundreds of pounds to some providers. The data that you produce, the things that you do, the demographic that you're in is worth a lot of money to people. And what you're giving up is that continuous observation. But what's more concerning is that you'll probably forget that you gave someone access to it because you didn't close that relationship down. There isn't any interest in closing those relationships down by the provider because they're just finding a little bit more data ticking away in the background while you go off here or go off there or buy that or buy this. They're knowing what you're doing. And I'm not saying this is a big conspiracy or anything. This is the way our society has been set up, is without these endings, and then we're doing it again and again and again through the products, through the services, and now with digital, we're starting to do the same thing with closure experiences. Now, with closure experiences, there's 5 different models as well. We've got a timeout thing. That's a pretty simple thing. You have a 2-week holiday. You're in that 2-week holiday. 2 weeks is up. And then with credit out, you run out of money. You're going to have to put some more money into the pot or whatever. Pay as you go. In-game purchase, another good one. There's loads of money to be made in that. We didn't particularly milk that one when we were doing games. We had a far more honourable system of paying up front. If any of you paid the £3, whatever it was, for Monument Valley, thank you very much for that. But it's a quality game you were purchasing, not an in-game purchase. I've spent loads of money on Clash of Clans, probably way more than how much I've spent on Monument Valley. But that's another thing. So task event completion. The plumber comes around, he fixes the boiler, you discuss it, is it fixed? Yes, it is. That's completed. And then with withdrawal is something a lot more about the legalities of stuff. A lot of us haven't got a clue about that one, because it's often wrapped up in horrible, complicated language we don't understand. It's alienating to us. It's a terrible user experience. But the one which has come in, and there's this inactivity and dormancy, which when we start using apps and services, we move away from them and stop using them. They become inactive, but a lot of them are still pinging things in the background, being merged with other databases. You as an individual have a certain amount of values, and that's been merged with another database as another company used. But you've forgotten you used it. You didn't shut that account down. So what we can do about it? Actually, note to self, I can actually not do black on grey. It doesn't really work well. Acknowledge it. We can acknowledge closure experiences exist, and we can start designing for it. I know everything in my life is going to end at some point. Probably not with the services, but my marriage will end in either divorce or death, which isn't nice, but it's very factual. I can design for it. There's some of these services and products and digital products, we can start to theorise, what's it going to look like when it ends? And we can prepare for it. You can put end dates into things. It's surprising how few end dates are in T's and C's, for example, or any sort of digital things you're experiencing. Talk about it with the customers that you design things for, because I think it makes them feel secure as well. And also, the people who've left services, they're important people and they've left for a certain reason. A lot of companies aren't interested because they're not paying any money anymore, but actually they're very valuable. So just a quick recap. I hope I've given you a good idea of what closure experiences is. And we've looked at through how that's emerged in our society through a life cycle and how that's changed in the customer life cycle and what created this situation. Some of those industries from the past and how that's changed, how closure experiences have changed in those industries, and some examples of that with some models and techniques. And that's the end of that.
Thanks, Joe.